This is Esma Rajapova. Esma was a world-renowned singer of Macedonian Romani descent, who often spoke out about the prejudices that the Roma people face in the Balkans. To paraphrase the Encyclopedia Britannica, the Romani people originated from northern India, but slowly immigrated up to Europe by the 14th century. Today, the Roma are considered to be an Indo-Aryan ethnic group. They aren't fully Asian, nor are they white. This perceived racial difference has resulted in the perpetual marginalization of the Romanis throughout the Balkans. As reported by Balkan Transitional Justice, the Romani people face discrimination everywhere, from the citizenship office to hospitals to the classroom, and are frequently subject to racist attacks. During World War II, Croatia and Serbia exterminated the Roma in concentration camps, then sold their land for auction. As historian Daniel Vojak puts it, we can see how Roma property was systemically captured and how the local population participated in such theft. In recent years, another racial conflict has taken center stage in the Balkans, the migrant crisis. Since 2015, refugees and migrant workers, mostly from Syria and Afghanistan, have traveled north towards Europe in search of asylum. Most went through the Balkan stage towards Germany, but as the wealthier European countries have shut their doors and increased border patrols, these migrants are now stuck in the Western Balkans. As of April 18th of 2022, Balkan Insight reports that there are almost 3,700 migrants and refugees in Serbian-run state camps, not counting those camping in the woods or living in homes. These migrants face horrific conditions, from near homelessness to facing machete attacks and police brutality, to mention nothing of their public reception. The question is, why are these asylum seekers being subjected to racial violence? And why is nobody addressing it as such? Where, when, and how did the region of the Balkans learn to impose white supremacy? Is there a legacy of slavery that's been forgotten or hidden over time? What is the history of colonization and racism within the Balkans? To answer these questions, we first need to look at Charles Mills's white ignorance. Mills defines white ignorance through the lens of standpoint theory. Quote, if one group is privileged, it must be by comparison with another group that is handicapped. End quote. In other words, if white ignorance is the privileged group of knowledge which exists to uphold white supremacy, then there exists an alternate discourse of knowledge, which must be actively suppressed. In the context of racism within the Balkans, there are two main considerations. First, white ignorance must be historicized. The concept of whiteness, is a very recent phenomenon. So what has happened to our understanding of history before that time? What has been changed or hidden? Second, white ignorance tends to be obfuscated and difficult to identify. It's imperative that white ignorance be clearly distinguished as a matter of racial discourse and not mixed up with other areas of ignorance. This is difficult because white ignorance is already deeply intertwined with learning and memory. So how do we decide what is true? To understand white ignorance in the Balkans, we must first consider what area constitute the Balkans. The problem is, nobody seems to agree. Some areas are included by some scholars, whereas others tend to exclude other areas. So in the interest of simplification, we'll just examine the Western Balkans, which has been widely agreed to include Albania, Croatia, Bosnia and Herzegovina, Kosovo, North Macedonia, and Serbia. Extensive research revealed nothing about any of these countries admitting to a history of racial violence. But the Greek Empire certainly enslaved Black people. And so did the Romans, and the Ottomans, and the Western Balkans were a part of all three. This fits Mills's first prong of producing white ignorance. The history of slavery in the Balkans has been historicized to be before the production of the current nation-states, and therefore it can be forgotten. If anything, some Balkan historians insist that because the Balkan people were colonized themselves, they were equally marginalized as all of the other demographics of people forced into those empires. This sentiment has hidden the fact that during these periods of empire, the Balkan public benefited from white supremacy. As Raymond Detres notes in Colonialism in the Balkans, Balkan authors views themselves as civilized Europeans who supported colonial rule against the so-called savages of the rest of the world. And Black people still exist in the Western Balkans as a legacy of slavery. Rizo Shurla was a renowned Afro-Albanian photographer whose ancestors were brought over during the Ottoman slave trade. He lived through the 20th century during the Kingdom of Yugoslavia and passed away in 2003. These issues of racial violence are not a matter of the past, they continue to be relevant today. But the prevalence of racism continues to be muddled and overshadowed by the constant ethnic conflict in the Balkans that historians and YouTubers continue to try to understand. But really, that's upholding white ignorance too. The violence that has occurred as a result of ethnic nationalism, the deliberate destruction of information, the insistence from all sides that they are not the ones responsible for ethnic violence. If ethnic ignorance is the priority, then racial ignorance ends up getting sidelined, and white supremacy is the leading force for both. The Balkan people must come to terms with their own history, even the racist, violent, oppressive parts, if they want to reject white ignorance and move forward as a more progressive group of people.